There is a story that the world thinks it knows. A story about a rapper from Chicago who got loud, got rich, got controversial, and then got canceled. That is the version of this story that fits neatly inside a headline. That is the version that gets clicks, gets shared, gets argued about in comment sections at 2 in the morning. But that is not the real story. The real story is something far bigger, far darker, far more human than any headline has ever been willing to contain. The real story begins with a little boy in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago, sitting next to his mother at a piano, writing poetry at 5 years old, rapping at 7, and telling the woman who raised him alone that one day, the world was going to know his name. And the real story ends, or rather, has not yet ended, with that same man standing at the ash pile of a $2 billion empire he built with his own hands, and then set on fire himself. This is the story of Kanye West, and nothing about it is simple. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one, we put everything into them, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. To understand Kanye West, you have to go back to the very beginning. Not the beginning that most people imagine. Not a gritty street corner, not a trap house, not the kind of origin story that hip-hop was supposed to require in the 1990s. You have to go back to Atlanta, Georgia, June 8, 1977, to a household where the father was a former Black Panther and one of the first Black photojournalists in the history of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and the mother was an English professor who would eventually chair the English department at Chicago State University. Kanye Omari West was born into a home where education was oxygen, where words mattered, where creativity was not just tolerated, but expected. His name Kanye means the only one in Swahili. His mother, Dr. Donda West, chose that name deliberately. She believed it before he had done a single thing to earn it. When Kanye was just 3 years old, his parents divorced. Donda packed up everything she had, took her son, and moved to the south side of Chicago. She raised him alone. Middle class, not wealthy, not poor, but a single mother carrying the full weight of a child's future on her shoulders, while simultaneously building an academic career of her own. The South Shore neighborhood where they landed was vibrant and alive with Chicago's musical pulse. Gospel poured out of church doors on Sunday mornings, jazz floated through the air, blues ran underneath everything like a current you could feel, but not always name. Kanye absorbed all of it before he even knew he was absorbing it. He wrote his first poem at the age of 5. He began rapping at 7. He told his mother with the complete and absolute certainty that only a child can have, that he wanted to make music for real, not as a hobby, not as a dream he kept to himself, for real. Donda West did not dismiss her son. She never dismissed him, not once. Instead, she documented him. She photographed him. She kept his drawings, his poems, his earliest attempts at lyric writing. There is a quality of belief that only a mother can give a child, a belief that precedes evidence, that exists purely on faith and instinct, and Donda gave Kanye West that belief in quantities that most people never receive in an entire lifetime. It would shape everything that came after. It would also make everything that came after more painful than most people can imagine. Kanye attended the Polaris School for Individual Education in Oak Lawn, Illinois, a small private school built around the idea of fostering creativity and independent thinking. It was the right school for a kid like Kanye, who was, by every account, sharp beyond his years academically and already consumed by music and art in a way that did not fit neatly into a standard classroom. When he was 10 years old, something remarkable happened. Donda was invited to teach at Nanjing University in China as part of an academic exchange program, and she took Kanye with her. A 10-year-old boy from Chicago's South Side, living in China for a year, navigating a language he did not speak, a culture entirely foreign to everything he had known, finding ways to connect and communicate and absorb. That experience embedded in Kanye West a comfort with the unfamiliar, a belief that difference was not something to fear, but something to study, something to learn from, something to eventually incorporate into yourself. It was a year that most people would have considered disruptive. For Kanye, it was an education that no school could have provided. Back in Chicago, he continued through his schooling, eventually enrolling at Chicago State University, the same institution where his mother taught. He studied English and attended art classes. He was good at school. He was genuinely good at it. But music was pulling at him so hard by this point that sitting in a lecture hall felt like being held underwater. He was spending his nights in studios. He was making beats on equipment that cost more than his family could comfortably afford. Donda, to her extraordinary credit, helped him buy equipment anyway. She believed in what she was hearing. She understood, perhaps before anyone else did, that this was not a phase her son was going through. This was who her son was. And so at 20 years old, Kanye West dropped out of college. It was a decision that scandalized people around him. An English professor's son, a bright, academically capable young man, walking away from a degree. But for Kanye, staying would have been the real failure. He had one destination in mind, and he was not willing to take the slow road to get there. The decision to drop out would later, of course, become the title of his debut album. But before that album existed, before anyone outside of a small circle of Chicago music people knew his name, Kanye West spent years doing the thing that nobody ever talks about in success stories because it is not glamorous and it does not make good television. He worked. He ground. He made beats in the middle of the night for anybody who would listen. He developed a sound that was unlike anything else in hip-hop at the time, a style built on sped-up soul samples, pitched high, layered over drum programming that hit with a warmth and humanity that the harder, more aggressive production dominating the late 90s completely lacked. He called it, eventually, Chipmunk Soul. It was innovative and it was his, entirely his, and in time it would change the entire direction of hip-hop production. But in those early years, it was just Kanye in a small studio, making music that most people had not yet figured out how to appreciate. He moved to New York in 2001 because that was where the music industry lived and breathed and made decisions. And Kanye West wanted to be where the decisions were made. He was young, he was hungry, he was wearing polo shirts with the collar turned up and Gucci loafers when every other person in his industry was in baggy jeans and jerseys. And he did not care. He did not care because he knew what he was worth, even when the entire world had not yet caught up to that knowledge. He began building relationships at Rockefeller Records, the label co-founded by Jay-Z, Damon Dash, and Kareem Burke. He got his first major break producing a track called This Can't Be Life for Jay-Z's album Dynasty, Rock La Familia, in the year 2000. The track demonstrated something that every serious listener noticed immediately. Kanye West had a gift for creating emotional weight in music. Not just bangers, not just club records, music that felt like something. Then came the blueprint. In the summer of 2001, Jay-Z was recording what would become one of the most celebrated rap albums in history. He brought Kanye in. Kanye produced several tracks on that album: Izzo, H-O-V-A, Never Change, Heart of the City, Ain't No Love, among them. The blueprint was released on September 11th, 2001, the same morning that the world watched two towers fall in New York City, a day of shock and grief and confusion. And yet somehow in the weeks that followed, the album found its audience and became a phenomenon. Music critics recognized it as a masterwork. Fans recognized it immediately. And Kanye West, the young producer from Chicago, with the polo shirts and the soul samples, found his name suddenly in the mouths of everyone who cared about hip-hop production. The blueprint established Kanye West as one of the most gifted producers in the game. He went on to produce hit records for Ludacris, Alicia Keys, Janet Jackson, Beanie Sigel, Mos Def, Talib Kweli. His phone rang constantly. He was in demand. He was making money. He was making a name. But he wanted something more. Here is the part of the story where most people do not fully appreciate just how difficult what Kanye was trying to do actually was. He wanted to rap. He wanted to be an artist, not just the person behind the boards. He wanted to stand at the front of the stage, not sit invisible in the back of the studio. And when he went to the people at Rockefeller Records and told them this, when he walked into those offices and said he wanted to make a rap album, there was a silence. Not an encouraging silence, an uncomfortable one. Dame Dash, one of Rockefeller's co-founders, later described Kanye's appearance at the time by saying that he wore a pink shirt with the collar sticking up and Gucci loafers, and that it was obvious they were not from the same place or cut from the same cloth. Jay-Z himself later told Time magazine, "We all grew up street guys who had to do whatever we had to do to get by." The implication was clear. Kanye did not fit the template. Multiple record companies, not just Rockefeller, heard him out and passed. The reason was almost always the same. He did not have the street credibility. He did not have the hard life story that the industry believed rap required at that time. Kanye West said it himself in a 2005 interview with Time magazine. He said, "It was a strike against me that I didn't wear baggy jeans and jerseys, and that I never hustled, never sold drugs. But for me to have the opportunity to stand in front of a bunch of executives and present myself, I had to hustle in my own way. I can't tell you how frustrating it was that they didn't get that. No joke. I'd leave meetings crying all the time." Let that sit for a moment. Here was one of the most gifted musical minds of his generation, the man who had just helped create one of the greatest rap albums ever made, leaving label meetings in tears because no one would take him seriously as an artist. That is the part of the Kanye West story that gets glossed over in the legend. The rejection was not just a closed door. It was a repeated, systematic message from an entire industry telling him that who he was, at his core, was not enough. Not commercial enough, not street enough, not the right kind of black man for the kind of music they were trying to sell. He kept going. That is the thing about Kanye West in those years. He kept going with a ferocity that was almost frightening in its intensity. He produced. He networked. He played his music for anyone who would listen. And eventually, against the recommendation of others, Damon Dash signed Kanye West to Rockefeller Records in 2002. Mostly, as the story goes, to keep him as a producer and prevent him from going elsewhere. But it was the opening Kanye needed, and he was not going to waste it. He began recording his debut album. He had been working on material for years at that point, since 1999, building it track by track with the meticulous care of someone who understood that this first record was not just an album. It was a statement. It was a case being argued before the jury of an entire culture. It had to be undeniable. And then, on October 23, 2002, at approximately 3 in the morning on a Los Angeles road, everything almost ended before it could begin. Kanye had spent the night in a studio, producing tracks for Beanie Sigel, Petey Crack, and the Black Eyed Peas. Long sessions were nothing unusual for him. He worked with the kind of obsessive, relentless energy that comes from someone who feels time running out even when it isn't. He was driving home in a rented Lexus when fatigue overtook him. He fell asleep at the wheel. The car drifted across the lane. It collided head-on with an oncoming vehicle. His jaw shattered in 3 places. He suffered nasal fractures. He was rushed by ambulance to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, where surgeons placed a metal plate in his chin and wired his jaw completely shut. The other driver in the collision broke both of his legs. Kanye West was lucky to be alive. Donda West received the phone call at 5 in the morning. She wrote about it later in her memoir, Raising Kanye. Life lessons from the mother of a hip-hop superstar. She heard the phone ring and she knew, the way mothers know before they answer, that something had happened to her son. She thought she was getting the call that he was gone. Instead, she got the call that her son was in surgery, that he was alive, that he would need time to heal. And she drove to Los Angeles and she sat with him. This woman who had believed in him before anyone else, who had bought him equipment she could not afford, who had moved to Chicago alone and raised him alone, and watched him write poetry at 5 years old. She sat next to the hospital bed, and she was grateful that he was still breathing. 3 days after the crash, with his jaw still wired shut, with pain medication in his system, lying in a hospital bed in Cedars-Sinai, Kanye West started writing lyrics. He heard a CD playing in his room, Chaka Khan's Through the Fire, and something in that song, in that voice, in that particular line about going right down to the wire, spoke to exactly what he was experiencing in that moment. 2 weeks after the accident, before his jaw was even close to fully healed, he walked back into a recording studio. He sat in front of a microphone. He rapped, with the wires still in his mouth, with the metal plate still in his chin, with pain medication between takes just to get through the session. The song he recorded that day was called Through the Wire. And when you listen to it, when you really listen to it, you can hear the strain in his voice. You can hear the jaw that will not fully open. You can hear a man refusing to let even a shattered face silence him. He later said of the accident, "The only thing this accident is saying is, I am about to hand you the world. Just know at any given time I can take it away from you." Through the Wire became his debut single. It was released in September of 2003 and became a genuine phenomenon, not just commercially, but culturally. It was unlike anything that had been on the radio. It was a hip-hop song about surviving a car crash, sampling soul music, performed by a man whose jaw was wired shut when he recorded it. It was vulnerable and defiant and deeply, almost embarrassingly human at a time when hip-hop was supposed to be invulnerable, supposed to be hard, supposed to be anything but the sound of a man admitting that he was scared and hurt and grateful to be alive. People responded to it because they recognized something real. The success of Through the Wire finally forced Rockefeller to give Kanye the green light to complete his debut album. The case that the industry had refused to hear for years was suddenly being heard because the public had voted with their streaming and their radio requests and their money. The College Dropout was released on February 10th, 2004. It debuted at number 2 on the US Billboard 200 chart, selling 441,000 copies in its very first week. That number alone was remarkable, but the real story was not in the sales figures. The real story was in what the album was. It was nothing like anything else in hip-hop at that moment. While the rest of the genre was still deeply invested in street narratives, in hypermasculinity, in the kind of toughness that required constant performance, Kanye West made an album about religion, about family, about the pressure of materialism, about what it felt like to nearly die and come back and realize that the world you had been trying to impress might not be worth the cost of the performance. Singles like Jesus Walks, All Falls Down, and Slow Jams became not just hits but conversations. They were songs that people talked about, argued about, felt something genuine about. Slow Jams, featuring Twista and Jamie Foxx, became Kanye's first #1 single as a lead artist. The album was nominated for Album of the Year at the 2005 Grammy Awards and won Best Rap Album. Rolling Stone and NME would later rank it among the greatest albums of all time. Time magazine named it one of the 100 best albums ever made. In 2004, Kanye West, the kid who left meetings in tears, the producer no one would sign as a rapper, the man in the polo shirt with the collar up, stood at the podium at the Grammy Awards and accepted one of the most prestigious awards in the music industry for the album that every label in New York had told him was not going to work. Before we go deeper into what happened next, take a second and let us know where in the world you are watching from. Drop it in the comments. We love seeing the community that is building around these stories. And if this story is hitting the way we hope it is, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a single video. The Grammy was not the beginning of a comfortable chapter. It was the beginning of a more complex one. Because what success did for Kanye West was not soften him. It confirmed him. It confirmed every belief he had ever held about himself when the world was telling him otherwise. And it added velocity to a personality that was already moving fast. In the fall of 2004, just months after The College Dropout changed his life, Kanye West founded his own record label, Good Music, which stood for Getting Out Our Dreams. The name was not accidental. It was a mission statement. He signed John Legend as one of his first artists, and John Legend's debut album, Get Lifted, produced in part by Kanye and released through Good Music in late 2004, received 8 Grammy nominations and made both men look like geniuses. Kanye was not just building a music career. He was building an infrastructure. He was thinking like an executive even then, at 27 years old, fresh off his debut album. That instinct for ownership, for building the table rather than just taking a seat at someone else's, was woven into him from the beginning. Late Registration arrived in 2005 and was even more critically celebrated than The College Dropout. It debuted at #1. It featured an orchestra throughout, pushing hip-hop into sonic territory that critics had not expected the genre to inhabit. Rolling Stone gave it a rare 5-star review. It won 3 Grammy Awards, including Best Rap Album, making Kanye only the third person in Grammy history to win Best Rap Album twice. Then Graduation came in 2007 and became one of the most commercially anticipated album releases in recent memory, largely because of a public battle between Kanye and 50 Cent over who would have the bigger first-week sales. 50 Cent had publicly promised to retire from music if Graduation outsold his album Curtis in their shared release week. Graduation sold 957,000 copies in its first week in the United States alone. Curtis sold 691,000. 50 did not retire, but the statement had been made. Kanye West, the soft-spoken producer from Chicago who wore polo shirts, had just outsold one of the most commercially dominant rappers on the planet in a week that the entire music industry had been watching. By the fall of 2007, Kanye West was the most critically acclaimed rapper on earth and one of the most commercially successful. He had 3 consecutive #1 albums. He had Grammy Awards stacking on his mantle. He had his own label. He had production credits across the most respected records in the genre. He was 30 years old and he was, by any reasonable measure, at the absolute height of his powers. And then, on November 10th, 2007, Dr. Donda West died. She was 58 years old. She had undergone cosmetic surgery, a tummy tuck, liposuction, and a breast reduction, and chose to recover at home rather than in a medical facility. The day after her procedures, she experienced a sore throat, pain, and tightening in her chest, and collapsed. She died from complications related to heart disease combined with multiple post-operative factors. Her death was ruled to have been preventable. The state of California would later pass legislation in her name requiring medical clearance before elective cosmetic surgeries. But for Kanye West, no legislation, no tribute, no amount of acknowledgement could touch what he had lost. He blamed himself. He said it publicly. He told a UK magazine in 2015 that if he had never moved to Los Angeles, his mother would still be alive. Whether or not that was true, it was the story he lived with, and the weight of it was enormous. The people who knew him best in those years described someone who was present and absent simultaneously. Someone still functioning at an extraordinarily high level, publicly but privately carrying a grief so total that it had no floor. Kanye West's ex-wife, Kim Kardashian, wrote about it years later, describing him as a brilliant but complicated person who had experienced the painful loss of his mother and had to deal with the pressure and isolation of his position in the world. Multiple friends and collaborators who knew both the pre-2007 Kanye and the post-2007 Kanye described a person who changed after Donda died. Not entirely, not in every way, but in the ways that matter most. 808s and Heartbreak came out in November of 2008, just over a year after his mother's death, and in the wake of the end of his engagement to his longtime partner, Alexis Pfeiffer. It was nothing like any rap album anyone had heard. No braggadocio, no chest beating, just synthesizers and auto-tune and raw, almost uncomfortable emotional exposure. Songs about loneliness, about loss, about loving someone who is gone. Critics were divided at the time. Some felt it was a mistake, a misfire, an artist disappearing up his own emotional navel. But fans responded to it with an intensity that surprised even the people closest to Kanye. It debuted at #1. And in the years since, music history has revised its judgment entirely. 808s and Heartbreak is now understood as one of the most influential albums of the last 2 decades. Drake's entire emotional, confessional aesthetic is rooted in it. Frank Ocean's willingness to center vulnerability in R&B owes a debt to it. Kid Cudi's sound grew directly from it. Post Malone, Travis Scott, the entire emotional landscape of modern popular music was irrigated by an album that Kanye made while grieving his mother with his jaw figuratively still wired shut. The pattern was becoming clear. The hardest moments of his life kept producing the most consequential work of his career. My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy arrived in November of 2010 and silenced every critic who had ever doubted him. It was dense and cinematic and operatic and violent and tender and musically brilliant in ways that took time to fully comprehend. It debuted at #1. Rolling Stone gave it 5 stars. Pitchfork gave it a perfect 10. a score that publication reserves for works it considers genuinely historic. Time named it the best album of 2010. To this day, it is regarded by many music historians as one of the greatest albums ever made in any genre. Kanye West, the dropout, the crying kid leaving label meetings, the man in the Gucci loafers that nobody thought was a rapper, had made something that would be studied and discussed for generations. The commercial machine was running perfectly. The critical consensus was unanimous. He was at a point in his career that most artists never reach, where both the public and the critical establishment were in complete agreement. This was genius at work, and it was exactly at this peak of musical achievement that Kanye West turned his full attention to what he had always considered his second parallel ambition: fashion. He had been interested in clothes, in design, in the language of visual aesthetics since he was a teenager. He had already begun collaborating with a bathing ape and with Nike on limited edition sneakers as early as 2006. The Nike Air Yeezy, released in 2009, was a cultural moment. Sneaker collectors camped outside stores. Resale values climbed to multiples of the retail price almost immediately. The Air Yeezy proved that Kanye West's instincts about design were not a hobby. They were a second talent operating at the same level as his musical talent. But the relationship with Nike was not working on the terms Kanye needed. He had approached Nike management with a proposal, a royalty on all Yeezy shoes sold. Nike refused. Their position, as Kanye later described it in a 2019 Forbes interview, was that they could not give royalties to celebrities who were not professional athletes. Kanye's response was, "I'll go to the Garden and play one-on-no-one. I'm a performance athlete." Nike did not change their position. What happened next is one of the most consequential business decisions in the history of the entertainment and fashion industries. Kanye West walked away from Nike. He turned his back on the most powerful sportswear brand on the planet. The entire sneaker world reacted with something between disbelief and ridicule. You did not walk away from Nike. Nike was the throne. Collaborating with Nike was the validation. Walking away from it was either arrogance or madness, and most observers assumed the latter. Kanye had his own word for it: leverage. In November of 2013, he announced on Angie Martinez's Hot 97 radio show in New York City that he had signed a deal with Adidas. The terms of that deal, particularly the restructured version finalized in 2016, were unprecedented in the entire history of celebrity brand partnerships. Kanye West retained 100% ownership of the Yeezy brand. Adidas would serve as the exclusive producer, marketer, and distributor, and Kanye would receive a 15% royalty on all wholesale sales. For context, Michael Jordan's royalty from Nike on Air Jordan sales was estimated at around 5%. Kanye West negotiated a deal 3 times more favorable than the deal of the most commercially successful athlete-shoe collaboration in history. Adidas themselves described it publicly as the most significant partnership between a non-athlete and a sports brand in history. The first collaborative Yeezy Boost shoe with Adidas dropped in February of 2015. The Yeezy Boost 750 sold out in 10 minutes. Not in a day, not in an hour, 10 minutes. The demand that Kanye had always known was there. The demand that Nike had been content to satisfy in small controlled doses erupted. The Yeezy Boost 350, released later in 2015, became arguably the most culturally dominant sneaker of its era. Lines stretched around city blocks on release days. Resale prices climbed to 5, 6, 7 times the retail value. Adidas, a brand that had been trailing not just Nike, but the younger American brand Under Armour in the years before the Yeezy partnership, began its most significant period of market growth in decades. By 2017, Adidas had officially surpassed Nike's Jordan brand to become the #2 sneaker brand by market share. The Yeezy line was generating an estimated $2 billion a year in revenue for Adidas, representing approximately 10% of the entire company's annual sales. Forbes valued Kanye's cut of the partnership at $1.5 billion, pushing his total net worth to approximately $2 billion. He was, according to Forbes, the richest black man in American history. Read that again. The richest black man in American history. The kid who was turned away from record labels because he wore a pink polo shirt. The producer who left industry meetings in tears. The man who rapped with his jaw wired shut in a Los Angeles studio at 3 in the morning because stopping was not something he knew how to do. $2 billion. An empire built not on inheritance, not on investment banking, not on a tech IPO, but on beats and sneakers and the absolute relentless refusal to accept someone else's definition of what he was allowed to be. But even as the numbers climbed, even as the Forbes covers appeared, and the warehouse orders kept growing, and the Adidas stock price reflected the Yeezy effect in real time, there were things happening behind the scenes that the business pages were not capturing. In 2016, Kanye suffered what was described publicly as a mental health episode and was hospitalized. He had been operating at an almost superhuman pace, touring, recording, designing, building multiple businesses simultaneously, and carrying a grief for his mother that he had never fully processed. The hospitalization led to a tour cancellation, to a period of public silence, to headlines that were more concerned with what it meant for his upcoming projects than with what it meant for him as a person. He was released after a short stay and returned to public life, seemingly unwilling or unable to slow down, and the machine kept moving. It kept moving through 2018 when Kanye made comments on a TMZ appearance that slavery sounded like a choice, comments that caused a public outcry and drew the first serious public response from Adidas, who said they had taken note of the statements and were monitoring the situation. The phrase monitoring the situation was the kind of careful corporate language that signals concern without commitment. Adidas monitored. The partnership continued. The shoes kept selling, and Kanye kept going deeper into a public persona that was becoming harder and harder for the corporate world to manage from a distance. He supported Donald Trump publicly in an era when that position was deeply polarizing. He launched a presidential campaign in 2020 under circumstances that drew concern from people who cared about him. He and Kim Kardashian, who had been married since 2014 and had 4 children together, North, Saint Chicago, and Psalm, announced their separation in early 2021. The divorce was finalized in November of 2022. Through all of it, the Yeezy brand held, the Adidas partnership held, the $2 billion held, until it didn't. October 2022, Paris Fashion Week. Kanye debuted his Yeezy runway show and sent models down the runway wearing shirts that read, "White Lives Matter." The response from the fashion world was immediate and overwhelming. He did not walk it back. Over the following days and weeks, he made a series of statements on social media and in podcast appearances that were openly anti-Semitic, including a post threatening, in his own words, to go DEFCON 3 on Jewish people. The words were, as Adidas would later describe them, unacceptable, hateful, and dangerous. Gap terminated its partnership. Balenciaga terminated. Creative Artists Agency, his talent agency, terminated. Foot Locker pulled Yeezy products from shelves. TJ Maxx followed. The cascade happened with shocking speed, a week of dominoes falling one after another, each cancellation triggering the next. And on October 25, 2022, Adidas announced the termination of its partnership with Yeezy, effective immediately, all payments canceled, all production suspended. The announcement came 18 days after the company had placed the partnership under review. 18 days from review to termination. When Adidas made the announcement, the company had $1.3 billion worth of Yeezy sneakers sitting in warehouses. Investors later sued Adidas in the United States, alleging that the company had long known about West's offensive behavior toward employees and management, that the incidents described in the termination announcement were not new, that they had been happening for years inside boardrooms and creative sessions, and that Adidas had chosen to absorb that behavior rather than address it because the financial returns were too significant to risk. Whether that lawsuit succeeds or not, the allegation points to a pattern that runs through this story like a thread. The world was willing to tolerate almost anything from Kanye West as long as the money kept flowing. And when the money stopped being worth the cost, the relationship ended with extraordinary speed. Kanye himself posted about it on Instagram in real time. He wrote, "I lost $2 billion in one day, and I'm still alive. This is love speech. The money is not who I am. The people is who I am. $2 billion in one day." He knew the math. He watched the valuation change in real time, and he published about it, and he framed it not as tragedy, but as testimony. Forbes quickly revised his net worth to approximately $400 million, accounting for his music catalog, some remaining real estate, and the remnant of a Yeezy brand now operating as a tiny fraction of what it had been. The richest black man in American history had become, in 18 days, someone who had lost more money in a shorter period of time than almost any individual in the history of American wealth. The real estate story adds another layer to the financial picture of these years. In September of 2021, Kanye paid $57.3 million for a Tadao Ando-designed beachfront home in Malibu, one of the most architecturally significant private residences in the United States. He never moved in. Instead, he stripped the interior completely, gutting it down to bare concrete. He listed it in December of 2023 for $53 million and sold it in late 2024 for $21 million, a $36 million loss on a single property. His Bighorn Mountain Ranch in Wyoming, purchased for creative retreats and album recordings, was sold back to its original owners in September of 2024 as part of financial restructuring. Property by property, the material accumulation of the empire years was being unwound. And yet, even through all of this, the music kept coming. In February of 2024, Kanye, operating without a record label, without a major distribution company, without the corporate infrastructure that every industry expert said was essential, released Vulture's One in partnership with Ty Dolla $ign. He distributed it solely through streaming services. It debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. It earned more than $1 million in its first week, without Adidas, without Gap, without CAA, without any of the relationships that had been the scaffolding of the empire. #1, which told a story that the business pages struggled to know how to write. The story that even at a fraction of his financial peak, even with every major corporate relationship severed, Kanye West could still walk to the top of the chart carrying nothing but the music. The story of Kanye West is not ultimately a story about money. The $2 billion is a data point. The loss of the $2 billion is a data point. But the thing this story is actually about is the space between those data points. The belief of a 3-year-old boy who told his mother he wanted to make music, the decade of rejection, the jaw wired shut at 3 in the morning in a Los Angeles hospital, the mother who believed before anyone else believed, the mother who was then taken by a surgery that should not have killed her, the grief that had no bottom, the genius that kept producing masterworks through all of it. The story is about what it costs to be a certain kind of person in the world, uncompromising, uncontainable, unable or unwilling to fit the shapes that institutions require of the people who work inside them. Kanye West built a billion-dollar empire. He built it against every obstacle that was placed in his path. He built it by walking away from Nike when it would have been easier to stay. He built it by recording music through a wired jaw when it would have been easier to rest. He built it by making albums that defied every expectation the industry had of what he was supposed to be. The empire was real. The $2 billion was real. The Grammy Awards, the cultural influence, the shoes that sold out in 10 minutes, the production credits on some of the most celebrated albums in the history of hip-hop, all of it is real, and all of it will remain real regardless of everything that came after it. There is a version of this story that ends with a verdict, with a clean moral, with a lesson that can be printed on a motivational poster and shared. That is not this version. This version ends the way honest stories end, with a question, an open file, a human being who is too complicated to be summarized in a verdict. The question is not whether Kanye West was a genius. The evidence settled that question long ago. The question is what we do with the full picture, all of it, the college dropout and the anti-Semitism, the Yeezy empire, and the warehouses full of unsold shoes, the Billboard chart toppers and the canceled concerts. What do we do with a story that refuses to be simply good or simply bad? What do we do with a person who built something historic and then, seemingly deliberately, refused to protect it? Maybe the answer is that we do not need to do anything with it. Maybe some stories do not require a lesson. Maybe some lives are just too large to be contained in the categories we built for them. Maybe Kanye West is not a cautionary tale. Maybe he is not a triumph narrative. Maybe he is, and always was, exactly what his mother named him, the only one. And maybe the only one was always going to be something the world did not quite have the right category for. What do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. Where do you land on this story? Was this a business failure, a personal crisis, something else entirely? Let us know. And subscribe if you want to be here when we tell the next one. Because the next story is coming, and trust us, you are going to want to be in the room when it does.